Last week, in our weekly coverage of Latin America and the Caribbean, we spoke with Nicaragua's Foreign Minister, Dennis Moncada, about some of the problems his country's faced at the hands of the United States over the past few years. We discussed the attempted coup in 2018 that was thwarted by the government, but that resulted in the deaths of a number of police officers and civilians at the hands of the U.S.-backed insurgents, and a recent report issued by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is dominated by the United States, calling Nicaragua's criminal prosecution of those involved in the attempted coup a violation of the human rights of those responsible. This week, we're taking a look at some of the positive affirmative steps that are being taken by governments in the Latin America Caribbean region, in particular today, Bolivia and Nicaragua. First, we speak with Brazil-based journalist Camila Escalante about the situation in Bolivia. She's the co-founder and editor of Causation News and co-hosts the English language weekly podcast entitled Latin American Review there. She's also the Latin American correspondent for Press TV. And then we take a look at things in Nicaragua with Nicaragua-based journalist Stephen Sefton. Camila, thank you for joining us. And, we've heard some of the bad things that the U.S. has been up to, certainly since Monroe, actually. And we'd like to get a better picture of some of the positive affirmative things that the governments and people of the region are doing for themselves.
Well, in the last year, we've seen a lot of really great initiatives, in particular by the government of Bolivia. You might know that Bolivia has some of the lowest inflation anywhere on the American continent, and they've just taken some very important decree or measures by decree, actually, from the executive power in order to ensure that Bolivia is not as affected by some of the things going on in the world, the conflict, and of course, the way in which that has impacted so many of the economies of our region right after, of course, the region suffered from the economic fallout from the pandemic. Luis Arce, the president, actually created a Bolivian agricultural production company to strengthen food sovereignty and boost agricultural production. This is a lot like what Nicaragua does, and Bolivia has very high level of food sovereignty, and they're producing and incentivizing the production of wheat. We know there was a huge wheat shortage around the world when this Russia special military operation began. Right. And they're incentivizing maize production. This government is making sure that it is sufficient on fuel and maintaining the cost for both producers and for regular Bolivians. So the costs of things on the Bolivian shelves at grocery stores have stayed the same because they're producing wheat. The price of bread, which is a very important food that people consume largely for breakfast in the country, has remained the same. And so we've seen this sort of across the board and all sorts of different things. It's just in the last year. But they're also continuing to invest in education, in health, and all sorts of other things. And this has kind of continued since the MAS took back power in 2020. They haven't had to impose any sort of austerity as we see taking place in other countries such as Ecuador. And this is, of course, because of the sovereign model in Bolivia in which they have complete control over their natural resources. And so things like lithium and other minerals that Bolivia has, they are exploiting and using those profits towards investing in social programs for the betterment of, the living conditions in the country. We're talking about a country that, has been largely, underdeveloped for some time, and they're investing in some really great and crucial infrastructure projects, particularly in the countryside, the rural countryside. So I know Stephen probably can really, understand how that really looks a lot like what we've seen in Nicaragua as well.
What's interesting, Bolivia, you would think, first of all, you've had, the rise in the price of commodities generally, and the exports from Bolivia include natural gas, silver, zinc, lead, tin, gold, etc., and also agricultural products, soybeans and soy and quinoa in particular. That the main trading partner in terms of exports is not the United States at just barely 8%, but rather Brazil at about 18% and Argentina at a similar number. In other words, they are integrated pretty deeply into the region.
Yeah, and it escaped me, Don. I was going to say that one of the most important things that they have boosted production of in the country is fertilizer. There was also a fertilizer shortage when this conflict began 14 months ago.
Yeah.
And so Bolivia is now able to not only supply the whole country, but export to its neighbors. And we're probably going to see some very important trade agreements and cooperation with Brazil now that we have Lula in power here.
And also interesting is in terms of the import partners, again, it's not the United States that's barely 8.5% of the total imports of Bolivia, but China at 21.7%, and Brazil at 17%, and Argentina at about 13%. Again, very well integrated and very deeply involved also with China.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this, part of the economic model and strategy of President Luis Arce is to look to the immediate region, the Andean community, the countries around Bolivia. And so they're another very important trade partner is Peru. So Peru, yeah. Chile, Argentina, these are all countries that they have been looking inwards to find mutually beneficial projects and not looking, to the north any longer.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And Stephen, some things maybe that you could relate for people here to understand. I mean, we discuss Nicaragua from time to time, but something on point.
Yeah, in relation to what Camila has just pointed out about Bolivia's situation, Nicaragua's situation is somewhat different because it's a much smaller country, a population of under 7 million people, and it's also the victim of getting on for 200 years of history of being much too close to the United States. So its economy depends in large measure on the United States. But one of the interesting things that parallels what Camila was saying about Bolivia is the way Nicaragua has diversified its trading partners. And also, somewhat similar to what Camila has noted in the case of Bolivia, Nicaragua's trade with its Central American neighbors is now the second most important part of its trading relationships, of its international trading relationships, although the United States does still remain its overwhelmingly most significant yes. Export market.
Yeah.
But there are lots of things one can say about the very positive things that have happened in Nicaragua under its revolutionary government. But the main thing I'd say, I don't know if Camila has found this in the case of Bolivia, the main thing that I'd say is the democratization of Nicaragua's society and economy. So, and on the one hand, you have massive infrastructure investment that has taken place over the last 15 years, and that has opened up internal markets for parts of the country that did not really have good access to markets. Nicaragua's Caribbean coast that was previously practically cut off in physical terms. It would take almost 2 days for a truck to get from, say, Managua to the capital of the Northern Caribbean region,
right.
Bilwi. But that's completely changed as a result of this infrastructure program, and that is very much part of the democratization of the country, the economic democratization of the country that is opening up economic opportunities for people at grassroots across the whole country and not just the Pacific region close to Managua, which used to be the case in the past.
Right.
And so in addition to that, and also somewhat similar to what Camila was explaining in the case of Bolivia, Nicaragua has had the most successful economy in Central America for many years now, even despite the effects of the 2018 failed coup attempt. Nicaragua recovered remarkably quickly from that failed coup attempt, and it also was the economy in the Central American region that was best able to overcome the effects of the pandemic that Camila also mentioned.
Right.
So I'd say that aspect of the economic democratization and the diversification of Nicaragua's trade relationships have been extremely positive and made it possible for Nicaragua to ride out in a quite successful way the kinds of illegal coercive measures that have been implemented against Nicaragua over the last few years by the United States and the European Union. And that has to do with what I mentioned earlier, that Central America is now Nicaragua's second most important trading partner. Right. So if the United States and its allies wanted to intensify coercive measures against Nicaragua, they'd have to think twice about that, because they'd been hurting their own allies in
right.
Guatemala, particularly in Guatemala and Honduras, but also Costa Rica as well.
And their own trade relations. They do a decent amount of business with Nicaragua, the largest by far, as you mentioned, trading partner both in terms of imports and exports. They're facing a shrinking share of that across the region to China and internally. And if they want to continue to shoot themselves in the foot, sooner or later they run out of toes, if you catch my drift. And it's interesting, too. There's one point of commonality here. In each case, Bolivia and Nicaragua, we've had an unsuccessful coup, ultimately, and essentially an economic turnaround and improvement in the lives of people there, both in terms of having peace, social and domestic political peace, and prosperity, compared to the successful quote-unquote coup in Kiev, which has brought nothing but war and destruction and complete collapse of the economy. I'd like to thank you both for your time today. And I hope to be able to do this again next week.
Okay, thanks a million,
Thank you
Don.
so much, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.